Hello, welcome back. We are going to talk about the three elements that bind together religious communities now: myths, rituals, and value systems. Myths are sacred stories. They're usually ancient narratives. When we say myth, we're not implying falsehood, but we are usually implying something that is ancient. Ancient narratives that continue to have enduring meaning for a culture or religion. Even though they've happened a long time ago, there's something about these stories that help people to know who they are, know their relationship to the ultimate, know the right kind of way to seek harmony with the ultimate, perhaps see bad decisions that can have catastrophic results. Myths are special accounts of unique persons and unique events that involve the person's encounter with the higher reality, with the ultimate power. Could be the realization of the ultimate truth, like breaking through to enlightenment or something. Could be God speaking to someone from heaven, as if calling out to Abraham or Moses. These stories can also, they're not always people that do things the right way. Sometimes they're cautionary tales of people who make bad decisions that have catastrophic results. But in any case, the myths are supposed to give us an idea of how people have discovered or found or attained this harmony with the ultimate reality in the past. The myths involve, of course, important symbols and symbolic elements pointing to the ultimate or transcendent reality, and the most important myths are known by all members of the community. Now, the religious leaders will know some myths that maybe the common people won't, but there are some myths that you really have to know. You can't really be a practicing Jew without an understanding of the story of the Exodus and the Passover. You have to know that Moses led the Jews out of slavery in Egypt 3,400 years ago. That's part of the formative story of what Judaism is. Can't really be a Christian without knowing that Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. That's one of the stories that's foundational in the religion of Christianity. The stories may be oral or written. They're usually in a written form today, but there are still some indigenous tribes that may pass on these stories orally. What's interesting about myths, these sacred stories, they're sacred because they have this sacred symbolism, but they also involve sacred time and sacred space. We're speaking of this in the abstract. If you want to talk more specifically, sacred times and sacred places. And maybe I can move this up. Oh, look, places isn't blocked at all. And these, we'll see in the next category, these sacred times and sacred spaces are often recreated in the rituals. So what do we mean by sacred time and sacred space? Imagine that you're sitting in your classroom and all of a sudden the building starts to vibrate and shake and everybody's holding onto their desks or tables and the roof is ripped off and a blinding light shines into the room and you hear a thunderous voice going, "My children," in REL, whatever class you're in, "I've chosen you to take my message to the world in the final days of humanity." And we're all, of course, sufficiently shocked and awed, and probably we've peed ourselves. But when the encounter is over, we notice that we're all kind of glowing. Maybe it's residual glory. And we also notice we have powers we didn't used to have before. I look at someone who's disadvantaged in some way. Maybe they're in a wheelchair, and just my good intent, they stand up and start walking, and we find out we can do miracles. So anyway, we go out and make it our number one priority to share the message that we were given with the rest of the world. And this religion grows so quickly, well, it's hard to ignore people that are glowing and doing miracles, right? Anyway, this very quickly becomes the number one religion in the world. My question is this: is your college going to repair the roof of the building and then have regular classes in this classroom again next semester? And the answer is, of course, no. This room will never be used for common, ordinary, practical purposes again. This place now has sacred significance. I mean, all of us who were converted will certainly pool our resources, and we will, appropriate this location. It will become the greatest site of religious pilgrimage in the world. More people will come here to see the place where this event happens than anywhere else on earth. And on what day do you think perhaps people will be most likely to make pilgrimage here? Well, on the day that this happened. So what's happened is this event that has been a connection between the ultimate, the transcendent in this world, has created sacred space and sacred time. This place where it happened is now sacred. It will never be used for common reasons again. Okay? People will come and they will view the place. It might be a deep point of faith for them, reaffirming their religion. And the time that it happened will be a sacred day. I mean, in our new religion, maybe it'll replace Christmas. Obviously, we're just talking about a ridiculous story here. But this is how sacred time and sacred space is created. So a better example, we mentioned earlier the Exodus from Egypt. We mentioned a festival called Passover that commemorates the last meal that the Israelites ate in captivity, knowing, believing, those that did, that they were going to be led out of captivity the next morning. And it's called Passover because in the middle of the night, the angel of death passed over all of those houses of those that believed the word of God and put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts and lintel posts. And so the holiday is called Passover. Jews still celebrate it today. And when they celebrate it and sit down at the Passover meal, they're actually recreating this event, this sacred meal. They're recreating the sacred time that it happened 3,400 years ago, give or take, depending on how you compute the time. And they're recreating this sacred space. They're eating this meal, in a sense, that was eaten back in Egypt at this time. And they will give thanks to God because they were all slaves in Egypt, and with a mighty hand, God led them out. Were they all slaves in Egypt? Well, of course, the ones that are observing the Passover meal and praying this prayer today were never slaves in Egypt. But there's something about this sacred story that is crucially important. It tells them something about their relationship with God, about their covenant with God, about God's promises, about who they are as God's people. And so this story, if you're a practicing Jew, an observant Jew, is still crucially relevant today. And so we have talked about Passover. This, of course, is a ritual. So let's continue with this idea of sacred space and sacred time in talking about rituals here. The rituals are connected to the myths. In some cases, as in this one we're using as an example, Passover, it's actually reenacting, if you will, depicting the action in the myth. So these rituals also are sacred and symbolic. They're uniquely patterned symbolic actions. Now, not all of them are holidays. There are certain rituals that might be done every day. You might have a personal ritual of reading some scriptures before you go to work or school. That would be an individual ritual. There are communal rituals that are done with the religious community. Maybe you meet once a week, on Shabbat for synagogue, or you go to the mosque once a week to pray, or you go to your church once a week to hear a message or to partake in Holy Communion. These are also rituals that are symbolic. I mean, they have a meaning that is more than just their observed practical purpose, but they're all in some way symbolic, representing your connection to the higher reality, or how the higher reality has had an effect in your life, and they're very often connected to the myths. So rituals depict an understanding of ultimate reality. You might say cosmic or universal reality. Some reality that is always present and is always true. And something about your relationship to it. The most important rituals are known and practiced by all members, just as the most important religious myths are known by all members. Rituals involve sacred time and sacred space, again, often recreating the sacred times and sacred spaces in the myths. And we use the example, of course, of Passover, which is a great example. We are recreating this sacred time in Egypt, 3,400, give or take, years ago, and this sacred space where this original meal first took place. Now, in the case of Passover, this is what we call a holiday. Holiday obviously comes from the two words holy days. There are two different categories. This falls in the first category we're going to talk about, not in order chronologically, but in terms of how we're going to talk about them. This is a historical holiday. It commemorates what is supposed to be a historical event, an event with sacred significance that happened once at a certain time and a place. Jews are not let out of captivity every year on the same day, out of Egypt, obviously. This only happened once, but they're commemorating this event that happened once. So the Holy Day is the day every year that they commemorate this. Now, some holidays may not be on a yearly scale, but the vast majority of them are yearly, if you're talking about historical holidays. Another example of a historical holiday would be, of course, Christmas, commemorating the birth of Jesus, or Easter, commemorating the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there is another kind of holiday. In antiquity, we would normally call them festivals. Festival comes from the root word feast, because they involve some kind of a sacred meal. But we call them cosmological festivals. And we mentioned cosmological religions earlier that are finding ultimate meaning, ultimate purpose, ultimate power in the observed universe. And they are trying to, in some sense, attain harmony with the universe that they live in. Some of them may not even believe in a transcendent ultimate reality, but if they do, they believe that they're closest to attaining it when they're finding this ideal relationship or harmony with the cosmos, with the world that exists. And in cosmological religions, they tend to find sacred significance in the universe, that is, in the recurring cycles in the universe, or as we call them, cosmic cycles. You know that in the universe, everything goes in cycles. And all these cycles don't correlate with each other. There's not an even number of days in the year any more than there's an even number of days in the cycle of the moon. So we're going to have festivals observed at different intervals. The festival of the New Year is going to be at different interval than the festival of the new moon. Certainly going to be at a different interval than the celebration of the vernal equinox. Okay? So we're observing cosmic cycles. And here's the thing about cosmological festivals. Whatever the cycle of the universe is that we're attaching sacred significance to, it is actually happening at the time that we're celebrating it. So if we're celebrating, the seed time or the planting festival, we're really planting crops. If we're celebrating the harvest festival, we're really harvesting crops. If we're celebrating the new moon, it really is the new moon. If we're celebrating the full moon, it really is the full moon. If we're celebrating the equinox or the solstice or whatever it is, those events are actually happening as we're celebrating them. Again, you wouldn't say that about a historical holiday. Celebrating Easter, Jesus doesn't come out of the tomb every year at the same time and spend some time playing with the bunnies and hunting for colored eggs, and then go back into the tomb to wait for next year, kind of like the groundhog on Groundhog's Day. You see the difference, right? By the way, I mentioned bunnies and colored eggs. What do those have to do with Easter? Well, we're going to talk about a concept here that we're going to be talking about all semester long, which is called syncretism. Syncretism is a fancy way of saying putting things together. And when you have sacred traditions, sometimes they merge with other sacred traditions, and you end up with an understanding that involves different elements from different sacred traditions. So, as Christianity is spreading out, they are converting people that were already religious and already had an idea of sacred times and sacred space, already observed certain rituals. And one of the rituals that was very popular was the ritual that took place at the vernal equinox. This is the time in the spring where ideally the daytime is the exact same length as the nighttime of the day. And of course, after that, the days get longer until we get to the summer solstice, and then they start getting slower until we get to the autumnal equinox, when they are once again equal, the time that is light and the time that is dark. Most of you know this. So we're not only celebrating this vernal equinox, but also at this time of the year, everything seems to be coming back to life after a winter where everything died. And so This is prime time also to not only seek blessing in the coming agricultural year, but also to have rituals that connect to the promise of future life or a life after this life. Obviously, these kinds of stories, these myths and rituals have existed for a long time. Why? Well, remember when we talked about ultimate concerns? What's one of the ultimate concerns that people have? Probably the number one. They don't want to cease existing. They would like to believe that they go on in some form, or they come back, or are reincarnated, or they live on in spirit, or something. And so with this desire to go on, obviously you would expect that there are going to be sacred stories and sacred practices relative to that hope. So there are many different resurrection stories in sacred myths before Jesus is ever born. He's certainly not the first one. But if you're a Christian spreading the gospel, you believe that this story of Jesus rising from the dead is the ultimate example, or you might say the ultimate confirmation, that there is a hope of life after death. So if you're preaching your gospel to someone who already has the hope, who already has certain rituals that they perform that link back to some ancient myth that has some example of resurrection from the dead or reincarnation or something, what you're basically saying is, look, here is the ultimate example of the proof of this hope, that we go on, that we live on. And you're seeking to convert people to embrace this. But when you try to convert people, I'll tell you one thing that doesn't work. Some people don't realize this, and they're marvelously ineffective because of it. That is, if you go to people and tell them everything they've ever considered to be beautiful, honorable, valuable, and true is ugly and evil and somehow deceived, and they have to give it all up and start over, you don't convert very many people. People have to be severely disenfranchised somehow to be able to embrace some kind of a movement that considers everything they came out of evil and deceptive. It just doesn't work that way. If you're appealing to people who have some sense of good, and some sense of beauty, and some sense of ethics, and they're trying to pursue it in some way, then you're going to have to validate those things about their pursuit that are good. If you validate the fact that they are looking for truth, that they are looking for goodness, that they're trying to be the best people they can be, now you've established some common ground. And you can say, yes, it was good that you were trying to be this best person, but now there's a way that you can have more power to become the person you're supposed to be. Or yes, it was good that you hoped for the promise of resurrection, but now we have even greater truth that what you hoped for was true. Do you see what I just did? I told them about something better without having to denounce what they had already believed in as being evil. It's much easier to convert people if you let them hang on to what is precious and beautiful to them. If they have to give up everything that's ever been meaningful and true and honorable and noble and precious to them, you're not going to convert many people. So what you do is you convince them that what they're embracing is the ultimate example of what they've ever hoped for. But that sometimes involves letting them hang on to some things that are precious to them, which is why we have some traditions, people call them pagan traditions, but that's a marvelously unmeaningful term we'll talk about later, but traditions from cosmological religions involved with the vernal equinox or involved with resurrection stories. And so now, all of a sudden, we celebrate Jesus' resurrection with colored eggs. The colored eggs didn't come from Christianity, obviously. Bunnies were never used to represent Jesus' resurrection. They came from other religions. It's the same reason that we have a decorated fir tree next to a manger in a cave in Bethlehem when Jesus is born. Obviously, we don't have decorated fir trees next to animal feeders that people are laying babies in to use as a manger. Where did that come from? It came from converting European pagans to Christianity, who brought something that was beautiful and symbolically meaningful to them into Christianity. And now we celebrate the birth of Jesus with decorated fir trees. Another example of syncretism. Now, let me give you a different kind of syncretism. Syncretism between cosmological festivals and historical holidays. A lot of historical holidays, in monotheism especially, used to be cosmological festivals. For instance, the Passover festival used to happen at one time the same season as we celebrated the first fruits of the barley harvest. Moses receives the Torah, the law of Moses, we call it, the Mosaic covenant, 50 days later at Mount Sinai, and it's celebrated by a festival called Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, or Christians call it Pentecost, but it used to be the first fruits of the wheat harvest. Obviously, we know about the resurrection of Jesus taking place at a cosmological festival, time of year when a cosmological festival takes place. Why is it called Easter? The goddess Ishtar. Yikes. How about Christmas? Why do we worship, Jesus on December 25th? Why do we esteem that as the day he's born? We have no idea when Jesus was born. Probably wasn't December 25th, because if shepherds were keeping watch on their flocks by night, it'd be pretty cold out there if it was in December. It's because the holiday was already sacred and had been for thousands of years. It was first of all, we're talking about the winter solstice, the time when the days are the shortest they ever are. And that occurs in that period there, in the last week of December. It also had been the celebration of Saturnalia, or the worship of the god Saturn, the second tier of the gods there, if you're familiar with the mythology. It had been the celebration of the god Mithra, if you're familiar with Mithraism. And in the Roman Empire, in the 4th century, when finally we start celebrating the birth of Jesus, this had originally been the holiday where we commemorated Sol Invictus, the invincible sun god. And at some point in the 4th century, it was changed. And it became the celebration of not the invincible sun god, but the invincible Son of God. And so this new meaning, this higher meaning, this ultimate revelation kind of subsumes all of these other celebrations, but elements of their commemoration still remain in the ritual. The date itself, December 25th, the decorated fir tree. These are all things that had nothing to do with the story of Jesus, of course, being born. All right, you have a little bit of an understanding of symbolism. Now, when one religion appropriates some kind of sacred symbolism or image from another religion, we call it syncretism. So, not everything is syncretistic, okay? For instance, in Christianity, the cross is a key symbol that commemorates Jesus' sacrifice. This is not syncretized. We didn't take the cross from somewhere else and, if we're Christians, decide we're going to use, the cross of paganism, we'll use it here. No, this is brand new. So the cross in Christianity would not be an example of syncretism. Colored eggs certainly would. Decorated fir trees certainly would. Halloween in Christianity is the hallowed evening before All Saints' Day, which is November 1st. But most people don't even know that Halloween to them has a lot to do with the pagan tradition, where people think that the veil between this world and the world, the afterlife, is the thinnest, and previous people that have lived before might be able to pass between that veil, and if they're angry about something or they have any ill intent towards you, this could be a dangerous night of the year. And there's all kinds of mythology surrounding this that has nothing to do, obviously, with the Christian ritual. This is a little bit different because these really haven't been put together. They're kind of competing with each other, and the meaning of the Christian ritual is kind of just forgotten because this pagan tradition has hung on a little bit more firmly there. So we'll talk a lot more about the dynamic, different meanings in sacred times and how sometimes they syncretize, how sometimes they don't, how sometimes they compete, or how sometimes they'll come up with something brand new that isn't really taken from anything else at all. All right, let's move on here. Lastly, value systems. Doctrinal codes that are derived from the sacred stories, as the rituals are, or there are some people that think the connection is a little bit more of a problem. We kind of have a chicken or the egg thing, which came first, but in any sense, they're all connected to each other and explain each other. I've made this really simple. The value systems that are connected break down into what we might call doctrinal codes or theological teachings, beliefs about the ultimate reality, about world construction, the nature of this world that we live in and its connection to ultimate reality, and the human condition, our connection to this world, connection to the ultimate reality. Secondarily, moral codes that involve what it means to be a virtuous person, ethical action, which can be loving your neighbor as yourself, doing unto others, you should have them do unto you. That generally is the highest ethic in all religions. All they disagree upon is who in fact is your neighbor. Christianity and Islam are two of the ones that are kind of famous for believing you should love your neighbor, but having a lot of rules sometimes, why a lot of the people that live on this earth are in fact not your neighbor, but an enemy of God. And if God is going to punish these people for all eternity, that kind of relieves you of the responsibility of treating them like your neighbor. And again, that is a problem that is being widely debated in Christianity and in Islam. But in Eastern religions, we don't have as much of a problem with that. Even people with a different religious discipline or spiritual path might be considered to be your neighbor that you're supposed to love. And also, social responsibility. What is your role in the community that you belong to? All right, this kind of concludes our series of lectures on the features of religion. And again, the importance of this is so we've recognized certain things that are present in all of the world religions. Now, as we look at the religions, we're going to see how these different things are manifested in different ways in different religions. I mean, how are their myths similar? What similar motifs do they have, or how are they different? How are their understandings of salvation similar, or how are they different? How are their understandings of the ultimate similar or different? How are their understandings of the relationship of the community to the outsider similar or different? And so on. So, we're going to move on from here. I will see you in the next video.